So here, I wanted to speak to some of the challenges or the obstacles that HBCUs kind of face in today's educational landscape.
Hmm.
So first off, how do financial constraints impact the resources and the programs that are available at HBCUs?
Well, I mean, that is the perennial concern. How do you make sure that you, of course, as we've indicated, financial constraints are real problems for the students, and that they are the sort of focal point of a lot of the discourse. But in some instances, it's kind of hard to consider. How do we keep certain programs, certain departments at these institutions, and at really almost every institution? How do we keep them relevant, and how do we keep them existing? Um, you know, I will say that I'm an English professor, and you would think that all colleges would have English departments, but English departments, in terms of their ability to produce or ability to sort of help students think that you can get a degree or a marketable degree in English, is kind of a hard sell. And so that kind of also, how do we continue to make this department seem super valuable and like we're contributing something of merit to the institution? We're not in STEM, we're not in science and technology or so. And then these are the real sort of the fields that when people in administration see these fields, they see dollar signs. When they see English, nobody sees dollar signs. So that's a part of the discourse, I think, and that is kind of a challenge. But I think that that's kind of a challenge across the board for institutions. I mean, it's something that I feel acutely at this at HBCUs, of course, because that's the way that I see it. But I think honestly, kind of across the board, that's a concern.
Right. So I don't know much about it. I don't even know how they would determine. Are there schools where they don't have an English department? Like that would seem almost impossible. But
I mean, there's some schools that have English programs.
mm,
And again, that may not necessarily be just an HBCU. I mean, that might be like some of these technical schools or something like that. So I
mhm.
mean, there are institutions where it's not like you don't go to a tech school to major in English.
Right, right.
So it's kind of like a program there or something like that. But yeah, no, I mean,
Mm. Okay, and then what are some of the systemic barriers that HBCU encounters when it comes to funding and support and things like that?
hmm, I'm I feel a little bit less equipped to be able to provide substantive context for that question than might be particularly helpful for the discourse here.
Mm.
So I'm gonna go ahead and apologize on the
It's
front end
okay.
about that.
It's okay. For
In terms
sure.
of also not having, yeah.
I think so I really don't know much about. I mean, I guess schools get a lot of funding from the federal government. You know what I mean? And those kind of conversations have been had about different presidents slashing different numbers and so on and so forth. And so I've always heard recently, it feels like during the last presidential election and the upcoming one, it seems like now people are talking specifically about HBCUs when it comes to funding and presidential involvement. I think Trump took credit for something, but then something happened where they didn't end up getting the money. So I don't know very much about that. Are you more informed? It's more probably pertinent to you.
I mean, I remember that instance, and I remember the photo op associated with it, where you have all the presidents from these institutions. They all went to the White House or whatever, and everybody was supposed to be like, "Oh, well, this is a nice moment for us because we get to feel like we're getting something from this administration or whatever." And then everybody just ends up looking silly, I guess. Well, not necessarily looking silly, I suppose, but the situation just ends up being a little bit more complicated than people thought it might have been
Mhm.
when some of the realities of that situation make themselves apparent.
Right.
So, yeah, not a optimal situation for really anybody involved outside of the administration. One imagines who gets their nice little photo op with a bunch of black folks.
Right. 100%. And here's one: how do HBCUs navigate issues of representation and diversity within their faculty and their administration?
So that's interesting. I can say that there are a lot of different kinds of folks on faculty across the the welter of HBCUs that do exist. You have a lot of different kinds of folks from a lot of different backgrounds, because that's kind of the nature of what the fields are. Again, in English, um, in my graduate program, I counted myself as kind of a rarity because I was one of the only um, black male doctoral candidates in English. There was like one other dude that was coming up behind me, and then after that, it was kind of sparse. Specifically focusing on literature. We have people who focus a little bit more on rhetoric and composition at that particular institution, the graduate school I was at. But yeah, no, I mean it's literature is a kind of not very prevalent. There's not a lot of prevalence of black male figures in that field.
Mhm.
Um, but you do see them, of course. So it creates a dynamic wherein if departments and colleges and whatnot are hiring folks, you're going to have to hire a diverse array of folks. Because I mean, if you'd like to hire black folks, do so. I mean, you'll find them, of course, but you might have to cast a wide net. And I've seen departments that have had a whole lot of white professors, a whole lot of professors of other backgrounds and stuff. Also, I think that it's always super helpful when you can provide for students representation of folk who look like them as their professors.
Mhm.
I think that means a lot, and that was something that I cherished a whole lot about my experience at Morehouse. I was in history back then. I got my bachelor's in history, but every time I looked at my professors, I was like, "Yo, they look just like me." And for whatever that was worth, it was certainly a affirming kind of experience. So I looked at folks and I saw, okay, this is something that I could be doing eventually if I choose to go this route.
Mhm.
Um, but you always want to have a lot of different kinds of voices to hear from. You don't want to ever just create an echo chamber, one imagines, where everybody just looks like you and has had your exact experience, because then what can you really sort of teach me at that point, right?
Right.
And
And
I think
so
that
it
that's a
stops
part of it.
being as translatable to the real world, which you kind of touched on
Sure,
earlier. I would
sure,
imagine.
sure, sure.
And then, I would obviously the stigma attached with like the idea that it would be like discriminatory and we only allow black teachers and that kind of thing. That sounds awful. And then
Yeah,
I would imagine we know this to be true that people of
yeah, yeah.
varying backgrounds have like things to contribute,
Of course.
and so I would imagine it's not going to be exclusive, but I do think that like you said, having some black teachers and things like that would be pretty beneficial, specifically because I think even like growing up, they've like you just don't see a lot. Like having a black male teacher is extremely rare.
Yeah.
I don't think I had one growing like all throughout my education. I never had one. Well, actually, there was one. I believe it was Mr. B.I. Rishengo. He was a history teacher for seventh grade, and his name stands out because he was an African man, and he was the only black male teacher I ever had. So I mean, obviously we do need representation, but if once it becomes exclusive, it becomes something else entirely.
Exactly.